We'll get going here. This is Mike McCarthy with CARB. I work in the ECC division. I'd like to welcome everybody today to our hybrid workshop. We've got in-person and online. Actually, this is our first regulatory hybrid workshop from Riverside. Encourage people, if they have not been to the Riverside facility before, to make a trip here on one of the next events. But I just wanted to welcome everybody today. We are starting a regulatory process. As you know, it takes some time. We'll go over the timeline today and the logistics of where we're headed. But I just remind people at our workshop, right, we'll have staff present on a topic, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A, both in person and online. And we'd like to encourage, feedback and kind of an open dialogue. That seems to be the most useful to us in a workshop, is to get that kind of open dialogue going. I know it's hard to start from cold and just jump in there, and this is also, the first workshop in the process is the first step. So this is not the end all, right? This is the first. We got some concepts we want to talk about today and some ideas of where we're headed. And we'll have subsequent workshops that flesh out more details and concrete proposals. But I really appreciate everybody joining today, and hopefully online we got all the logistics worked out, and I will kick it over to staff to start working through the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome everyone. So as Mike said, we're here in Riverside in person and also on Zoom, which means we have some logistics to cover before we get into the substance of the presentation. So for those in person, just a little information on emergency exits. There's emergency exits to the rear of the room, through the lobby, back there, the opposite of where I've just gestured. And if there is a fire alarm, we are required to evacuate this room and immediately exit the building through the front entrance, probably where you all came in. And when the all clear signal is given, we'll come back and resume the workshop. But hopefully that doesn't happen. And then some Zoom logistics. So as Mike mentioned, there will be some breaks during the workshop for questions and comments. There will be 3 and then some open time at the end. So for those folks on Zoom, to be added to the speaking queue during those times, you'll be asked to raise your hand. You can use the raise hand function, or if you're on the phone, press *9. Attendees on Zoom will be on mute throughout the call until those Q&A sessions. If you've raised your hand, you'll be invited to unmute. And as Belinda just reminded me, maybe folks in the room can mute their phones as well. We'll also have the Zoom Q&A box available throughout the workshop for folks on Zoom to submit their questions. We may answer some of those just through Zoom directly, or if some are appropriate to answer live, we'll do that during the Q&A sessions. For those in person, of course, you'll also have an opportunity to ask questions and provide comment, and we'll be having folks come up to this podium over here. And as a reminder for everyone, when you're speaking, we'd appreciate if you could give your name and your affiliation when you're making your question or comment. So for any technical challenges on Zoom, we have the wonderful Joyce Wong available to answer those. Her email address is joyce.wong@arb.ca.gov. So for folks on Zoom having any challenges, please reach out to her. She'll be able to help. And then just a couple reminders, we have the meeting materials, including the presentation, available on the website. This workshop is being recorded, and we will be posting the link at that same website after the workshop. And just a little bit more on public comment and engagement. So in addition to verbal public comment today, we will be having an open written public comment period. That should be live today. Using that form is a great way to let the public see your comments that have been submitted, and there's a viewable public comment log. And just as a reminder, comments you share are part of the public record. This is a regulatory process. And of course, if you would like to discuss the rulemaking with us in more detail after this workshop, please reach out. The email address is cleancars@arb.ca.gov, and that will be shared again later. Okay, and one last reminder, we do have a tour of the Riverside facility going on this afternoon for those who pre-registered. That begins at 1:30, and we'll be meeting in the lobby. And this was, pre-registration was required, so unfortunately no walk-ins will be allowed. But if you did register, we look forward to seeing you at 1:30 in the lobby. Okay, so I think that's the logistics. So now we can talk through a little bit of the agenda. We're going to start with some staff introductions, and then we'll go through some background on California's advanced clean cars regulations and EPA's proposed multi-pollutant emission standards to set the stage for the discussion today. Then we'll go through an overview of the potential amendments to the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulations that we'll be considering in this process, and then go through sort of the initial concepts for each of those topics on greenhouse gas standards, criteria air pollutant standards, and ZEV assurance measures. And again, we'll pause after each of those segments for Q&A. We'll wrap up with some timeline and next steps, and hopefully have some time after that for open public comment through noon. Okay, so before we get to that background information, we want to do some staff introductions. And here on the slide, we have a list of the staff that are going to be helping to lead this rulemaking, and so this can be sort of a reference for you as we go through this process. So I'll start with myself because I'm already talking. I'm Anna Scodell. I'm fairly new to the Advanced Clean Cars branch, and I'm going to be leading this rulemaking. We have, and we're seeing that the slides aren't quite advancing. Oh, and that. All right, we'll go to the next slide, and then we'll come back to this one. Sneak preview of a pie chart nobody has ever seen before on the Advanced Clean Cars. Well, we can just introduce folks, and the list of staff will be in the PDF that's available on the website. Okay, so again, I'm Anna Scodell. I'm the lead staff for this rulemaking. We have Belinda Chen right here, who's the manager over this rulemaking and the greenhouse gas regulation and the low emission vehicle regulation. We have Anna Wong. Wave a hand, there you go. She's the manager over the zero emission vehicle regulation. We have Mike McCarthy, who already spoke, who's our sort of technology and policy advisor over this process. And then we have lots of staff who are going to be helping to support this effort. We have Jason Gordon, there he is, on evaporative emissions. Ryan Hart next to me, our ZEV technology expert. Jiali Hu over here, who's going to be helping with the criteria standards and analysis for light duty vehicles. Cody Livingston, over in the corner here, working on the greenhouse gas standards, modeling and analysis. Ugo Obieshi, also working on greenhouse gas technology and emissions control. Kevin Sophie, who's not here today, but he's helping with the medium duty vehicle criteria standards. And Tao Zhen, right here, on motor vehicle air conditioning. So that's a who's who on the reg, and we promise that list will be available in the PDF online. Oh, and we have our attorneys up here as well, Pippin Brailer and Wesley Dyer, who will be very helpful throughout the process as well. Okay. Oh, and there's the slide. And here's the, okay, great. So, and thank you for bearing with us on the tech. This is, as Mike said, one of the first workshops we've done in this room, so there's been a lot of coordination, and big thanks to Tuan in the control room, who is maybe not visible, but has been helping us out a lot as well. Okay, so I think that's the housekeeping. So now we can kind of start with the background on the Advanced Clean Cars program. And again, the idea here is to provide some context for today's discussion. So the first iteration of Advanced Clean Cars, or ACC1, was adopted in 2012. And this is a regulatory package that brought together multiple different regulations to control criteria air pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles, covering the 2017 through 2025 model years. So Advanced Clean Cars 1 included updates to the low emission vehicle regulation for criteria air pollutants, the California's greenhouse gas emission standards for greenhouse gases, and a zero emission vehicle or ZEV manufacturer sales requirement. Great, and then in 2022, last year, our board updated the Advanced Clean Cars program to establish that next phase, covering requirements for the 2026 through 2035 model years. ACC2 includes, just as ACC1 did, several elements that work together to reduce emissions from California's new vehicles. So first, ACC2 requires that an increasing percentage of new vehicle sales meet a zero emission standard, ramping up from 35% in the 2026 model year to 100% by the 2035 model year. second, looking not just at the quantity of ZEVs, but also the quality of ZEVs, ACC2 includes a suite of what we call ZEV assurance measures. And the idea there is to give drivers confidence in relying on new and used zero-emission cars and trucks to help secure those emission reductions. So the assurance measures include standards like meaningful battery warranties and transparency for drivers around the health of their battery. And this is a new piece in Advanced Clean Cars 2 to help complement that ZEV stringency. Also in ACC2, we updated the low emission vehicle regulation for criteria air pollutants. And the idea there is to continue to clean up those conventional internal combustion engine vehicles to reduce exposure to pollution, even as we're increasing the ZEV stringency. And I want to highlight here that CARB did not update the greenhouse gas standards as part of ACC2, and that was partially in anticipation of forthcoming federal rulemaking in this area. Which brings me to EPA's multi-pollutant emission standards. So in May of this year, EPA released a proposal for more stringent greenhouse gas and criteria air pollutant emission standards for light and medium duty vehicles, and that would cover the 2027 through 2032 and later model years. So EPA accepted public comment on this proposal through July of this year, and they expect to release a final rule this upcoming spring. And we did submit comments to EPA on their proposal. And as we go through some of our concepts for today, we'll talk a little bit about our comments that we made. And because EPA's program will apply at the federal level, it's really important for us to consider their policy in the context of developing California's program. Okay, so that brings me to the focus for today, the amendments to the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation. So we're considering amendments to the low emission vehicle regulation, the greenhouse gas regulation, and new ZEV assurance measures to continue to drive progress on emission reductions for motor vehicles, and especially for communities that are most impacted by motor vehicle pollution. As far as the scope for the greenhouse gas standards, these amendments would establish that next phase of the greenhouse gas program beyond the 2025 model year as we look to achieve our ambitious climate goals here in California. And as far as the context for EPA's program, we'd be looking at areas for alignment with EPA where it makes sense to reduce unnecessary burdens while still making sure that we have a meaningful California program. For criteria air pollutants, as I mentioned, we did amend the LEV program in 2022. So when we think about the amendments here, we're looking at areas for alignment with EPA, again, in cases where to reduce those burdens, but in the situations where EPA's program achieves equivalent or better emissions reductions. And we're also looking at a few other minor amendments. On the ZEV assurance measures, we're using this rulemaking process as an opportunity to consider two new ZEV assurance measures on interoperability standards and a consumer-facing ZEV label with the goal of further supporting consumers and the ZEV market. I want to emphasize that we're not intending to revisit the stringency of the ZEV regulation or the ZEV assurance measures that we adopted in ECC2. And I also want to note that the starting model year will really depend on the nature of the provisions that we include in the amendments, but our plan is to provide appropriate lead time. Okay, so that was the background and sort of the high-level scope of what we're doing. Now we'll go through each of those pieces in turn, and again, we'll be pausing for Q&A after each section. So starting with the greenhouse gas standards. I want to talk a little bit about why we're talking about updating these standards. And first and foremost, we have ambitious climate goals here in California to address the climate crisis, including achieving carbon neutrality by 2045 and an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by that time. So we're looking to dramatically reduce emissions from all sectors of the economy. And even with the ZEV standards adopted in ACC2, we know that conventional vehicles will continue to be sold in California through the 2035 model year, and those vehicles will continue to operate well beyond that date. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions from these vehicles is really important to achieving our state's climate goals. And so as I mentioned, we did not update the greenhouse gas standard in ACC2, so the requirements level out in the 2025 model year. So another reason we're looking at this is to help make sure that California's requirements are meaningful and achieving our objectives. Even with the more stringent federal standards that have been proposed and with our ZEV regulation, having a meaningful program on the books helps provide that assurance that those reductions will be achieved and maintained here in California. And having a meaningful California program is especially important given the federal context in recent years. We're certainly very encouraged by EPA's recent proposal, but there has been a lot of upheaval at the federal level in this sector, which has led to a lot of sort of volatility over the past several years. So when CARB adopted the GHG program in 2012, we had harmonized with EPA's program to establish one national program for emissions, and that program is shown in the dark gray dashed line on the slide. But as you can see, the federal government revised those standards, first dramatically reducing the stringency and then undoing that action and increasing the stringency. So over this time period, the standards that manufacturers were required to meet in California remain unchanged, and that stability is important for industry to support planning and product development. So we still have a policy goal of reducing implementation complexity as we did in 2012, but maintaining a California program helps reduce that volatility and ensures that we get those emission reductions in California, regardless of what happens at the federal level. Okay, and then just a little bit more background. I want to talk a little bit about how California's existing greenhouse gas program is structured. It's been a while since we've workshopped this. So we have separate fleet average standards for cars and trucks. Those standards are measured in grams of carbon dioxide per mile. Manufacturers comply with those standards based on sales weighted averaging of the vehicles in their fleet, and that fleet does include their zero-emission vehicles. The standards are indexed to the vehicle footprint, which is defined as the area between the wheels. And what this means basically is that there's variation in the standards depending on the vehicle's size. The standards account for incremental upstream emissions from ZEVs and from plug-in hybrids, which means that those vehicles are assessed some greenhouse gas emissions in the compliance calculations. And then lastly, manufacturers can generate additional credits to count towards compliance through technology-specific credit programs. So there's the off-cycle credit program for technologies that reduce emissions, but where those emission reductions don't appear on the test cycle that's used to assess the vehicle's emissions. So for example, energy-efficient interior lighting. So that's one pathway. And then the program also has credits for technologies that reduce leakage from motor vehicle air conditioning or improve the efficiency of the air conditioning system. So that's sort of the overview of the existing program. So with that in mind, we'll now talk a little bit about the program elements that we're considering updating as part of this rulemaking. So as I mentioned, we're looking to establish that next phase of the program for beyond the 2025 model year, so looking at the fleet average standard as a whole. And then a few specific elements we'll talk through today: developing an anti-backsliding mechanism, the treatment of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, or PHEVs, motor vehicle air conditioning credits, and the use of ethanol. And as Mike said, I want to emphasize we're in the early phases here as we start to think through these concepts, so we're really looking forward to your input as we continue to flesh them out. Okay, so starting with that overall fleet average standard and the different things that go into that. We're showing here EPA's proposal as a starting place. We know that what they finalize may differ from what they propose, but ultimately their final rule is what manufacturers will need to meet at a federal level, so it makes sense as a starting place for us to think through these different program elements. So as I mentioned, EPA proposed to tighten the greenhouse gas fleet average standard, phasing in from the 2027 through 2032 model years and then leveling out. They're expecting the industry-wide average to be 82 grams of CO2 per mile by the 2032 model year. And to put that into perspective, that's about a 56% reduction over the current program. They're continuing to have the regulatory design based on those footprint index curves that I mentioned with separate car and truck curves, but they are proposing to flatten the slope of those curves and to narrow the difference between the car and truck curves, so reducing the variation across vehicles. Both CARB and EPA's current programs include ZEVs in the fleet-wide average, and EPA is proposing to continue to do so. They're also proposing to continue to exclude upstream emissions from ZEVs in their proposal, which is consistent with the treatment of ZEVs in the federal program now, but different from CARBs. And lastly, they're proposing to phase out and eventually eliminate those off-cycle credit programs that I mentioned. As we said, we know their final rule may differ from what's in the proposal, but we see this as a useful starting point. And as we're continuing to develop our concepts, we'll certainly be watching for their final and considering potential changes based on that. So there are a few key topics we want to talk a little bit more about that we highlighted in our comment letter to EPA on their proposal, and we're really looking for your input. So the first is developing an anti-backsliding mechanism. So what do we mean by backsliding? So on the chart here, we have EPA's proposed greenhouse gas emission standards. And in reviewing the proposal, we looked at the compliance pathway that their modeling assumes and looked specifically at the emissions from the non-ZEV vehicles in the fleet. And we found that the average emissions from those vehicles would actually be allowed to increase by 15 grams per mile, as you can see on this line. So again, here, as we documented in our comment letter to EPA, the modeling allows manufacturers to remove technologies on individual models while still complying with the fleet average standards. And this is something that their proposal does not currently address. And as we're looking at a time with the climate crisis where every GHG reduction feasible needs to be considered, we strongly urge EPA to include additional protections against vehicle redesigning in later years to remove those technologies and emit at higher levels. So we're also looking at this issue within California's programs where we could see similar patterns, if not worse. So here again, we have CARB's current GHG standard, which is flat after the 25 model year. And as manufacturers increase their ZEV sales here, the average non-ZEV emissions could increase dramatically. So that's why we're looking for input on mechanisms to reduce this backsliding risk, whether that be establishing maximum certification levels, removing ZEVs from the fleet-wide average, or other mechanisms that might be out there to address this issue. Next on the list is how the updated regulatory program should consider emissions from plug-in hybrids. So the majority of emission benefits from a plug-in hybrid result from the vehicle's ability to travel on electricity powered by the grid, as opposed to using its internal combustion engine. In determining how a plug-in hybrid's emission rate is counted toward meeting a manufacturer's fleet average requirements on greenhouse gases, EPA and CARB use a fleet factor to convert the PHEV's electric driving range into a weighting factor for those GHG test results. But real-world data suggests that emissions from PHEVs vary really widely depending on consumer behavior, and that the existing fleet utility factor may overstate emission benefits. In their proposal, EPA has proposed to lower the fleet utility factor curve, which would reduce the greenhouse gas emissions assumed from PHEVs. And in our comment letter, we recommended that EPA adopt an even more conservative curve than what it is proposed to avoid overcrediting these vehicles. We also recommended that EPA require manufacturers to report in-use data to have more accurately assess PHEV emissions in the future. So this is another area we're seeking input to inform our thinking on this topic, and we're especially interested in additional data sources on PHEV eVMT, or electric vehicle miles traveled, alternative utility factors we could use, and additional standardized vehicle data parameters that could be implemented and reported to CARB to help verify that PHEV usage. Okay, next we'll turn to the topic of motor vehicle air conditioning credits. So under both CARB and EPA's existing greenhouse gas programs, manufacturers can earn credits by using technologies that improve air conditioning efficiency or reduce leakage, and medium-duty vehicles are also subject to air conditioning leakage standards. So EPA is proposing to limit those air conditioning efficiency credits to internal combustion engine vehicles only, to eliminate the leakage credits for all light-duty vehicles, and eliminate the medium-duty vehicle leakage standard. And in our comments to EPA, we did support the elimination of the efficiency credit, but we highlighted some really important benefits associated with continuing to minimize leakage. So as we think about this issue in the context of our rulemaking, we want to think about ways to ensure vehicles continue to use those low leak systems to minimize that risk of refrigerant escape to the atmosphere. So again here, this is something we're seeking input on options to help ensure the use of those robust designs, whether that be a leakage standard, design review, or some other mechanism. Okay, and then this is the last slide in the greenhouse gas section. So during the, and this is on the topic of ethanol. So during the prior ACC2 rulemaking, we received several public comments about the use of ethanol as a potential strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we're seeking input from the public on whether and how to encourage or account for the use of ethanol as an element of the ACC2 program to help reduce emissions from conventional vehicles and PHEVs. Access and use of E85 fuel as a choice by drivers, paired with our low carbon fuel standard, would determine the greenhouse gas benefits for the in-use fleet. We're also seeking input on a variety of other considerations associated with increased ethanol usage, such as greenhouse gas impacts, equity impacts, and cost implications for vehicles. Related fuel policy actions would be needed for E85, including an update to CARB's fuel specification for E85. So we would welcome feedback on challenges and costs with expanding the E85 distribution network in California, including the additional cost to retrofit existing retail stations to be able to dispense E85. Okay, so that brings us to our first Q&A session. I'm going to hand it over to Belinda to MC.
So if you have any questions, please come down to this podium over here and then turn the microphone on so people on Zoom can hear you. And are there any questions online yet? No. Okay. Anyone in the room?
We'll give you some time to mull it over. And for folks on Zoom, you can use the raise hand feature to be added to the speaking queue, or if you're on the phone, press *9.
Okay, going once, going twice. Okay, if we have time at the end, if you think of a question, just feel free to, oh, no.
Oh, we do have a question.
Last minute, okay. People had to type, I know, we had to get them type. Oh, now we need someone to unmute. No, like on the Zoom, someone needs to be able to unmute.
Oh, do you want, it came in through.
Oh, okay, you want to just read it? Okay.
Okay, this comes from Ryan Ruika. What is CARB's timeline for E15?
So this is Mike McCarthy. Certainly, this is the vehicle side of the rulemaking. We're looking at all possibilities, right? We have a separate program that's our low carbon fuel standards. So we are working in concert with them on ethanol and what role E15 or E85 may have in California. At this point, we've been focused on the vehicle side of rulemaking for ACC2, and the low carbon fuel people have been looking at E15 more than we have. But certainly we're talking to each other, and I don't think I have any insight right now as to where they're at on E15 on future considerations.
Okay, we have another question. So Mike, don't go too far. This is from Richard T-Bay. You mentioned E85. Any thoughts on renewable diesel, the CARB or the EPA proposed revisions?
Again, this is Mike McCarthy. I don't think anything has come up yet. So in the California market, in the light duty sector, obviously you're probably aware diesel plays a very, very small role. It is a much more significant role in the medium duty sector. In this rulemaking that we're talking about for GHG, we're looking at the light duty sector, not the medium duty. The medium duty has historically been covered by the heavy duty program. So in the GHG space, diesel is a very, very, very small part of the market share. So we have not spent much time about that. And And then, we already did our criteria pollutant stuff in the previous ACC rulemaking. But I guess if there's something specific to renewable diesel in the light duty sector that you'd like us to think about or do, please submit comments to that extent. And again, even in the medium duty sector, we are not really touching the GHG for medium duty right now, but CARB will get to it eventually as part of the heavy duty GHG rulemaking stuff. And if there's something in the criteria pollutant space, certainly for medium duty, diesel plays a role there as well. All right.
Okay, maybe we'll,
yeah, but we'll answer that one offline.
Okay. Okay, so let's go to some of the raised hands on Zoom. Let's go with Joyce to unmute.
Okay. Dean Taylor, we've unmuted your line and you're free to speak. Please remember to state your name and affiliation.
Hi, I'm Dean Taylor with the Strong Plug-in Hybrid Coalition. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I guess I have some questions, probably on like slide 17. You mentioned that your GHG fleet standard accounts for incremental upstream emissions for ZEVs and plug-in hybrids. And you mentioned that that was a difference from what EPA does, because EPA gives 0. So for example, are you counting mining emissions and battery manufacturing emissions for upstream?
No, we don't do the upstream manufacturing emissions. Right now, the only thing we have accounted for in our light duty GHG regulation is incremental electricity operation, the generation of the electricity used to fuel the vehicles. Right. So we have EPA did as well. We have a calculation in there on some assumptions on gasoline upstream emissions to produce the gasoline, and then we have incremental emissions for electricity generation that are calculated as well. And then when they calculate ZEVs in the fleet average, you have to include that upstream electricity generation calculation, but it's not manufacturing cost or some of those well-to-wheel type of cradle to grave, wheel to wheel, all the different nomenclature people use, but it's not the upstream manufacturing emissions of the car or the engine or the batteries or anything like that.
Our coalition submitted comments also to EPA, and this came up. I mean, it's interesting that you're talking about like a backsliding, 15 grams per mile, but there's this massive difference when you just look at the emissions from mining and battery manufacturing for the battery, not forget about the engine and other things, is very significant. Huge difference between a 100-mile range BEV and a 500-mile range BEV. Similarly, between the different types of plug-in hybrids, it's much more than the 15 grams per mile. And it also, in our comments to EPA, that's I think a consideration when you're also looking at the fleet utility factor. I mean, it cancels out. I mean, we cited several sources showing that a plug-in hybrid with 35 miles range was equal to like a BEV 300, and a lot better than a BEV 500 or 600. So it's a really important topic, I think, to start getting into somehow.
So just to be clear, so in our regulation, we don't account for that, but certainly in the associated environmental analysis and benefits that we do, CARB has been increasingly in all sectors trying to take a more holistic, bigger picture approach and try to account for those kind of things. So I think you'll see in our associated supporting documents, when we look at regulatory benefits of the program, we do try to look at a bigger picture, well-to-wheel type benefits, even though the regulation itself, the vehicle regulation, may only have a portion of that accounted for in it.
It's good that you're not being siloed, but I think we're thinking to be even more unsiloed and think about it from even a regulation point of view, or at least take that into account, that there's huge differences between the different types of ZEVs and plug-in hybrids.
Understood. Understood. We'll note that as a comment as well. I mean, that's certainly helpful input. As you well know, it's a difficult sector to assess and quantify, but it's certainly not implausible.
Yeah, and we look forward to more comments and collaboration with you regarding the fleet utility factor. And you can read our comments. I mean, we're open to new solutions. It's just that there's a lot of work to be done in that issue.
We agree. We agree. We've been collecting some data and trying to mine it, but we're pretty early in the stages of a broader group of people using and operating PHEVs to try to learn about how they will be used. And so I think we and the manufacturers are learning a lot about different design structures and different usage habits.
Thank you.
Okay, Joyce, can we go to the next raised hand?
Yes. Julia Tazik, we've unmuted your line. You're free to speak. Please state your name and affiliation.
Good morning, everybody. Can you listen to me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Julia Tausig. I am the International Relations Coordinator at UNICA, the Brazilian Sugarcane Bioenergy Industry Association. Our members produce ethanol from sugarcane, first and second generation, and second crop corn in the center-south region of Brazil. We are the leading association in Brazil with more than 120 members. And last season, we have produced 31 billion liters of ethanol, around 8 billion gallons in total. So some of our members are already registered at CARB, and we have been together following the proposed revisions, especially the methodology of the use of low carbon fuel standard. We already submitted some comments and recommendations for adjusting that we believe that are key to improve the carbon intensity assessment. And this is really important in this discussion. And considering that CARB's technical evaluation of biofuel needs to be fair for different sources of energy, especially those willing to bring in scientific evidence to support their claims, we would like to ask that the Brazilian ethanol is scored fairly and accurately, so California residents can continue to enjoy the environmental benefits derived from the world's more efficient environmentally friendly biofuel. So I'm happy to hear that ethanol is in the agenda, right? And I would like to highlight here a few points related to the relevance of ethanol. Ethanol is not simply a biofuel for the transition to a complete electrification of the vehicle fleet, but rather than that, ethanol is an important decarbonization agent. And the Brazilian ethanol, whether from sugarcane or corn, can contribute to this process. The ethanol agro-industry has developed a lot in recent years, and CARB methodology should reflect this behavior, relevant to reducing the carbon intensity of our ethanol, sugarcane and corn. Some aspects that we believe should be considered by CARB, as per our comments already submitted before, ethanol has great potential to promote air quality, reducing NOx and particulate matter 2.5 emissions, therefore contributing positively to pollution reduction. We have the example of São Paulo City, the fourth largest city in the world, and there has been positive impact of biofuel policies on the population health. The partial replacement of gasoline with ethanol in the metropolitan area of São Paulo was responsible for a reduction of approximately 370 deaths in a year, an increase of 13 days of life expectancy of the population, and a reduction of more than 8,000 annual hospitalization because of respiratory and cardiovascular problems. For the public health system, this is a savings of $43 million per year. Sustainability is core to our business. Brazilian ethanol industry works based on circular economy system, where most of the residues from the production process are used into the process or becomes a new product. We have some examples like bioelectricity from bagasse, second generation ethanol from bagasse, biogas from vinasse, biomethane from biogas, and second crop corn cultivation, which uses same area where previously soybeans were planted, saving agricultural inputs and positively impacting on emissions reduction. Therefore, the Brazilian ethanol has a very low carbon footprint, and yet it is always investing towards negative footprint, such as projects related to biomethane credits and carbon capture storage. The fact that sugarcane is a crop associated with carbon removals from the atmosphere based on academic publications should also be considered. It is also worthy to mention that Brazilian ethanol production is totally dissociated from deforestation. We use only 1% of all Brazilian territory to produce ethanol, and the production is concentrated in center-south region and northeast of Brazil due to climate, soil, and rainfall appropriate conditions. Beyond that, all our members are certified by the Brazilian National Biofuel Policy, RenovaBio, which recognizes the positive externalities of the ethanol, and it has established strict requirements related to sustainability for producers. Some of the requirements I would like to emphasize here are compliance with environmental legislation and commitment with zero deforestation. All these requirements are audited by third party, and data from each producer becomes public, which highlights the transparency of the program. Finally, I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this workshop, and we look forward to hearing from CARB to the improvements in this methodology, in this rulemaking process. And we are at your disposal to support anything. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that input. I obviously, congratulations on that. We love to hear stories about success on air quality improvements. That's always a good to hear. And I'm glad to hear that you're actively already aware of and participating in the LCFS program, right? That is our primary mechanism to try to encourage low carbon intensity fuels and ensure there's financial incentive to produce such fuels and bring those to market here in California. And certainly that program looks to always accurately and fairly quantify the benefits of any low carbon intensity fuel. So again, we have the low carbon fuel staff are also engaged. They're aware of our workshop, and we're talking with them to try to come up with a coordinated effort. As you saw from the slides earlier, we have very aggressive GHG reduction plans in California, and we're trying to explore all avenues on what role cars and fuels may play, recognizing that we've got two separate programs and we don't want to be duplicative, but there could be some overlap, and we want to make sure we accurately quantify the benefits of any fuel choices we make.
Thank you. Count on us on continued support for this.
Okay, Joyce, do you want to go to the next one?
Yes. Graham Noyes, we have unmuted your line and you're free to speak. Please remember to state your name and affiliation.
Thanks very much. This is Graham Noyes with Noyes Law Corporation. Really appreciate the work that's gone into this already and the thoughtfulness with which CARB is approaching the issues in terms of alignment with the federal standards, but also looking at the big picture approach and life cycle analysis. Do a lot of work with Pearson Fuels, the largest E85 distributor or supplier in the state, and we have seen tremendous growth in E85, as CARB is well aware, since it's tracked to the gallon on an annual basis. And we saw, I think, the biggest jump ever last year at more than 65% increase in terms of use from 2021 to 2022, and that was essentially at a time of essentially a flat vehicle market where there were no more FFVs. But what was really happening was the oil spikes were causing the retail gas spikes out there, and we were steadily seeing E85 at a $1 to $2 a gallon discount. So we saw really great growth with consumers looking to save money out there, and a lot of activity in disadvantaged communities. I just want to share that we'll certainly be providing comments and inputs specific to the questions that you've asked around E85 use. We think that's a great tool to bring into the GHG reduction process out there, and wanted to hear if you had any initial thoughts to share, focused on the vehicle side, pertaining either to retrofit kits, which are being introduced. They're quite popular already in France, and actually some American vehicles are being retrofitted that go into the European market for E85, where they see the value there, both for retrofits and also potential opportunities to restart FFV manufacturing by the OEMs, where that is a very cost-effective way to create additional flexibility for consumers and greenhouse gas opportunities from ethanol, which is becoming more and more low carbon as reflected by LCF scores out there. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Graham. Yeah, I mean, certainly, we're trying to look at combined impacts of fuel and vehicle compatibility, capability, if you will. The only one I'll note, I mean, you did mention retrofits, which is probably outside the scope of what we'd be considering this time around, but we do have separate programs at CARB as well that look at alt fuel retrofits and those kind of conversion kits. But certainly, as you mentioned, a restart in FFV production, we are looking at possibilities of what combinations of vehicle compatibility and fuel availability might make sense to get us additional benefits in a cost-effective and manner that's consistent with our long-term goals.
Okay, I do want to jump to it's a more general question. I think that it's important for us to respond live. So Levi Tilleman has a question. Did CARB only coordinate with EPA through the formal comment process, or are there additional avenues of communication with EPA?
Okay. Yes, we do talk with EPA. So we as partner agency, regulatory agencies, obviously we coordinate a lot of the time, right? So we have routine discussions, both at lower staff levels as well as higher up executive sort of level discussions on policy and stuff like that. So that's the norm of how CARB and EPA operate over the years. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean we get inside information on what they're going to do or what they're going to finalize. We get the same treatment you get on that. But certainly during our development, we engage them. During their development, they engage with us. And we continue to coordinate and talk through pros and cons of different approaches and stuff like that. And as you can imagine, there's always talk about, especially when there's areas where they're different or we're different, and manufacturers have talked to them or us about alignment. We spend a fair amount of time talking with them there on a more informal basis with structured meetings.
Okay, and then I have one more that maybe, Anna, you can clarify in the slides on the timeline. It's from Nick Tambura. You mentioned EPA's timeline of 27 through 32. Are you envisioning the same time window for CARB for the GHG update?
Thanks for the question, and we'll go through I thought that question was going to be about our rulemaking timeline, which we'll talk about at the end. As far as sort of the model years that would be covered by our program, we're looking at post-2025, but the details of that are going to really depend on the specific nature of the provisions that we adopt through the amendments. We would be looking at going beyond 2032. ACC2 goes through the 2035 model year, so we'd certainly be looking at least to extend to that. But the starting model year will really depend on the nature of the provisions, but we're going to be thinking about and looking for input on appropriate lead time depending on what we include.
Okay, so I think maybe just in the interest of time, if your hand is still raised, I'm sorry we couldn't get to you now, but hopefully at the end of the whole presentation, there will be additional time for more questions. So can we move to the next slide? We'll start, turn towards criteria air pollutants. Oops. Okay, so next slide, please. In 2022, we finalized LEV 4, which is the next phase of our criteria pollutant standards for model years 2026 through 2035. And that was done in concert with the new ZEV regulation requirements for 100% ZEVs by 2035. So therefore, the focus of the LEV 4 standards was to ensure that the remaining internal combustion engine vehicles would be as clean as possible while not diverting resources for further development of ZEVs. So we did not change the overall NMOG plus NOx fleet average standards, but we did include ZEVs from counting towards this average. We eliminated the composite option for supplemental federal test procedure standards and created new cold start standards for quick drive away, partial soaks, and high-powered cold starts for plug-in hybrids. We tightened some aspects of evaporative emission standards. And then finally, we made changes to medium-duty vehicle standards to ensure equivalent stringency between the chassis and engine certified vehicles. As Anna mentioned earlier, we would consider amendments to LEV 4 based on what EPA finalizes for their Tier 4 proposal, if we can achieve equivalent or greater emission reductions while minimizing unnecessary burdens through alignment. Somebody say something? Nope. So these are the areas where we envision potential amendments to LEV 4, presuming that EPA finalizes something similar to what we have proposed. And I'll go through each of these in the next few slides, with the exception of the last bullet, which is basically just saying that we will take the opportunity of a rulemaking to propose some updates to test procedures and regulatory language to refine and clarify those requirements. So as noted in my earlier slide, we did not change the NMOG plus NOx fleet average, and rather we maintained it at a 30 milligram per mile level. But we do exclude ZEVs from being counted in the average to make sure that internal combustion engine vehicles do achieve lower emissions and continue to stay that way as more ZEVs enter the fleet. In contrast, EPA lowers their fleet average from 30 milligrams per mile to 12 milligrams per mile. And it may look like EPA is more stringent, but they do include ZEVs in their average at 0 grams per mile. So this is a case where we don't think that alignment is necessary, even though the standard looks to be so different. EPA does not have a ZEV regulation that guarantees any specific volume of ZEVs, but they did analyze their proposal, assuming that the non-ZEVs would achieve and maintain an average of 30 milligrams per mile. And they likewise project an increasing share of ZEVs that would result from their higher GHG emission standards. So in our view, auto manufacturers will not really need to deploy different emission control technologies to comply with both sets of regulations. So one area of potential difference relates to the certification bins. The red bins on the slide denote the newly proposed bins that EPA has proposed. And we are aligned with EPA above 30 milligrams per mile, but we do have some differences at the levels below 30 milligrams. And we know it simplifies things for manufacturers if the bins are identical, but we also spent a fair amount of time with industry in developing appropriate lower bins in LEV 4. And we feel that those balance in-use compliance margins, measurement capability, and impacts to malfunction thresholds on OBD systems. So we'll see where EPA ends up and then think about how to provide for consistent certification for auto manufacturers if they end up adopting something different than what we have. Moving to particulate matter standards, again, we didn't change the federal test procedure standards from LEV 3, but we did reduce the US 06 standards to 3 milligrams per mile. Meanwhile, EPA is proposing to lower their standard to 0.5 milligrams per mile for all their test cycles, which is based on the feasibility of using gasoline particulate filters. In ACC2, we did receive comments to lower to a 0.5 milligram per mile standard, but we did not do so for two reasons. One was given that the significant increase in ZEVs that we were expecting from the fleet, from the ZEV regulation, that the conventional vehicles would therefore become a smaller and smaller contributor to particulate matter. And secondly, we already had set the standard at 1 milligram per mile, which we felt was more stringent than the federal EPA standard of 3 milligrams per mile. But certainly if EPA finalizes a lower PM standard, we do not want a situation where manufacturers are decontenting vehicles for California, which would result in higher particulate matter emission levels than what vehicles are sold outside of California would be emitting. We still have areas in the state that do not meet ambient air quality standards for PM, and every little bit would help towards attaining compliance. So in this context, it does not seem prudent that we would head down a path where non-California vehicles would actually be cleaner than those sold in California. And we'll be exploring different options to ensure consistency with federal PM standards. Moving to evaporative emissions, Lev 4 lowered the evaporative running loss standards and created a design criteria for improved control of refueling emissions from vehicles with sealed fuel systems, commonly found on plug-in hybrids. EPA didn't propose any changes to their running loss standard, but we don't expect to align with them on that. EPA did ask for comment about adding a minimum canister size requirement similar to the one we have, and so we supported that. But notably, EPA did propose to extend the onboard refueling vapor recovery, or ORVR, requirements to medium-duty incomplete vehicles, and asked for comment on doing the same for light-duty incomplete vehicles. So if EPA finalizes that proposal, we would consider adding these ORVR requirements to our program. Okay, switching to medium-duty vehicles. We've consistently messaged that the options in the medium-duty vehicle class were provided to allow manufacturers to choose between meeting a chassis certification requirement or an engine certification requirement in order to accommodate the different manufacturers, some that make more light and medium-duty vehicles and others that are making heavy and medium-duty engines. And we were trying to allow for them to use similar methods for certification, but the goal was always to intend similar levels of emission controls. Unfortunately, that wasn't always what was happening. So CARB's heavy-duty low-NOx omnibus requirements added an in-use standard for all engine-certified products. And so under Lev 4, we added a similar in-use requirement to apply to chassis-certified medium-duty products. Our purpose was to ensure equivalent emission and robust emission control regardless of which emissions certification process was used. And as part of ACC2, the board resolved to continue coordination between the ACC2 regulations and the heavy-duty regulations and return to the board if needed to ensure alignment between the two in-use standards. And this past summer, CARB agreed to make further amendments to align the heavy-duty engine regulations with EPA's Clean Trucks Plan, which would affect both test procedures and standards for these in-use standards. So we will be coordinating with our heavy-duty rulemaking team to ensure our chassis certification requirements stay aligned. Okay, and this one gets really confusing. So Lev 4 maintained different standards for Class 2B and Class 3 vehicles that are distinguished by their gross vehicle weight rating, and specifies that certain medium-duty vehicles must chassis certify. Lev 4 also added a new requirement that I just mentioned where the gross combined weight rating above 14,000 pounds must also align with the heavy-duty in-use standards. Meanwhile, EPA is proposing that medium-duty vehicles with a gross combined weight rating of over 22,000 pounds must engine certify, which could be a divergence from Lev 4 requirements where a manufacturer may have to chassis certify for CARB. Needless to say, we do not want to see a situation where EPA, we need to see what EPA finalizes and if or how we can reconcile any remaining differences within the confines of our Clean Trucks Partnership Agreement and maintain the intended emission benefits of our adopted requirements. So in terms of fleet average standards, as part of NMOG plus, as part of Advanced Clean Cars 2, we did lower the NMOG plus NOx fleet average for medium-duty vehicles, and like light-duty, we excluded the ZEVs from counting towards this average. EPA is proposing to lower the fleet average for medium-duty chassis-certified vehicles, though as I mentioned earlier, these standards would be applied to a slightly different population of vehicles because some of the heavy tow vehicles would be excluded and going into engine certification, and because EPA is also allowing for ZEVs to be included in their average. So in digging into their regulatory analysis, EPA assumes that the non-ZEV medium-duty vehicles would emit at a fleet average of about 100 milligrams per mile, which is actually lower than our LEV 4 fleet average. Therefore, we will watch to see what EPA finalizes, including which vehicles are included or excluded in their fleet average, and consider whether we can use similar non-ZEV emission controls as the federal proposal assumes to lower our standards. The goal being to ensure similarly low emissions from medium-duty vehicles as the federal program may require. And then back to the certification bins, similar to light duty, there are some differences between the bins between our program and EPA's in the medium duty space. EPA's proposal includes many more bins at the lower levels than CARB has, so we will have to see where they end up and think about how to provide for consistent certification for manufacturers. Finally, moving to medium duty particulate matter standards. Like the light duty side, we didn't change the FTP standards for medium duty from LEV 3, but we did reduce the US 06 standards. And as with light duty, EPA is proposing to lower their medium duty standards to 0.5 as well, based on that capability of the gasoline particulate filters. But as we mentioned, for light duty particulate matter standards, certainly if EPA finalizes a lower standard than we have, we do not want a situation where manufacturers are removing emission controls from their medium duty vehicles for sale in California relative to the ones outside. So we will be exploring different options to ensure consistency with the federal PM standards. So that wraps up my presentation on criteria pollutant standards, and we'll now take questions. So if you have a question, please go to the podium up front or add it to the Q&A or raise your hand on Zoom with star 9, right? Oh, star 9.
Star 9 on the phone, or just the raise hand feature in Zoom. Or here in person at the podium.
Yeah, who wants to be our inaugural in-person questioner? A shy group here. Is there anyone online? Oh, wait. There's one on. Joyce, do you want to unmute the person who raised their hand?
Tammy Klein, we've unmuted your line and you're free to speak. Please remember to state your name and affiliation.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, my name is Tammy Klein. I'm with Transport Energy Strategies. Thank you all so much for your work on this. I just had a question going back to the first part of the presentation. How do you or will you address the issue of commanded enrichment, because that is in the EPA rulemaking? I don't know if you plan that for the backsliding provisions or at all. So if you could talk to that, that would be great. Thanks so much.
Sure. So we have not teed up an exactly parallel requirement, right? In both EPA and CARB regs, we have requirements to disclose and get approval of AECDs, auxiliary emission control devices, so the enrichment usually falls under that. We are talking with EPA a lot about their proposal and looking at a lot of the input and the comments that they got from feedback on that. In most notably, the amount of enrichment affects CO emissions, which has not been as important of an air quality problem here in California. So we don't have as much of an issue there as several other states do under EPA's purview. So EPA is I would say, more in the lead on looking for the environmental benefits from this proposal. But we're certainly aware of it. We're talking with them, and we're looking at alternate ways or additional ways to try to get those benefits. So, you know, we've had SFTP standards or US 06 standards in the past that have tried to ensure good emission control up through some extreme driving conditions. We've had limitations on how rich enrichment can be, but we still haven't had any real objective measures on how frequent it can happen in use. And so I think that's what EPA is attempting to address. There is differences in manufacturer implementations, and we're talking with them to see if there is ways to do that. I think, and this is a case where the focus right now is on EPA and where they come out in their rulemaking, and then we'll see how to harmonize with where they end up.
Okay, I have a question probably for Belinda. Is CARB, this is from Jackie Yeager, is CARB considering aligning with EPA's proposed timing and compliance options, default versus early compliance paths for the high GCWR or heavy towing MDVs?
Oh, no, I think it's a medium duty, right? Yeah, so I think this is kind of what we mentioned in the slide on the vehicle applicability. It's something we'll just have to evaluate once EPA finalizes.
And for the question that is the presentation available for download? It has been, I believe, posted in the chat. The link to the presentation, it's up on our website. And if you aren't able to see that, just let us know and we can either email it to you directly or we can send out on the listserv after this is done a link to the presentation. Okay, do you want me to read it?
No, we've got 2 questions here online about sort of related to commercial vehicles and PTO operation. One comment was about how does CARB regulate power takeoff equipment on trucks? The NOx, GHG emissions can be significant. And then another comment was about some commercial vehicles have a lot of idle time, especially for creature comforts like heating and air conditioning. So first, just remind people, right, the focus of our rulemaking, this one here, is largely light-duty vehicles. But we do have the criteria pollutant requirements for medium duty. We do have separate requirements for equipment that is mated for PTOs. Some of that falls in the small off-road equipment. Some of it some other requirements. I am not the expert, so I'm not going to opine about what those requirements are, how they are. That's not my area of expertise. I just know we do have the requirements in place to look at the impacts of those. I know we've had programs in the past that have been with some of the local air districts to incentivize electrified PTO operation. We've funded a lot of projects and demonstration projects for that kind of stuff. We also have anti-idling rules. So we've had some mandatory requirements in the past to either shut down at idle or to meet a low NOx level. And those have been revised in our heavy-duty regs several times. So there's a number of elements we use to go after this that I just have a barely working knowledge of, so I can't get into more detail there. If you have follow-up questions that I didn't get to, please submit them and we will follow up offline with more detail on what those exact requirements are.
Okay, and we have another question. Will CARB adopt EPA's high altitude standards?
So again, historically, we have tried to align where possible on standards that apply at low and high altitudes. In our ACC2 program and LEV 4 program, we expanded several of our requirements to apply at higher altitude. We are revisiting some of those ideas. We are also talking with EPA about it. Some of those are holdovers from way in the past when cars operated very differently at high altitude. Some of them still have some relevance. So we are talking with staff. I think we will look to see what makes sense, and this falls in the category of we don't just harmonize to harmonize, right? We try to harmonize where it still protects the environmental benefits that we believe we need, while, if we can, getting rid of undue or unnecessary additional testing burdens on manufacturers, right? So sometimes we can align and it works, and other times we still have a unique requirement. We try to minimize any impact on testing and certification. Okay, we also have one question on will the commercial and or towing apply to RVs or recreational vehicles? Our criteria pollutant requirements do apply to medium duty vehicles, which includes up to 14,000 GVWR. So you can get some incomplete vehicles that are made into some of the smaller RVs. So like Sprinter van or a Ford Transit van based type of RVs can fit into that. Stuff bigger than that will fall under the heavy duty program outside this program. However, the proposals that we adopted already for ACC2 for criteria pollutants for heavy tow capable vehicles to subject them to an additional in-use standard. I don't believe any of these vehicles would cross over that threshold into that gross combined weight rating high enough to be subject to that standard. For the most part, it applies to the pickup trucks in the medium duty sector that have high tow capability as opposed to any of the vans. There's a chance one of the most capable vans might get there, but I suspect even if that's the case, an RV made out of that product would lose too much capability that wouldn't meet that GCWR. So I would hazard a guess that, again, in the smaller RVs that would be in this category, none of them would be subjected to that additional in-use standard.
Hey, Mike, I just want to add on one more thing for EVAP on that topic. EVAP's kind of different than the other criteria pollutant standards in that it does apply to heavy duty, so long as that heavy duty vehicle is powered by gasoline and other volatile fuels. So like I think LPG. So just wanted to add that on.
No one in the room, really? You're so shy. Or you've been actually secretly just chatting things in the Zoom, huh? Are you ready, Rez? Okay, we're going to move to ZAS then. ZAB assurance measures, sorry.
I think maybe everybody's waiting until after this to come ask some questions in the room here. So, yeah, thanks everybody for sticking around for this, especially online and in person here. Then we're moving to our last section here where we're going to cover our new proposals related to zero emission vehicle assurance measures. So this is our last topic of the day, like I said, potential amendments to the ZEV regulation and related program updates. To bring us all up to speed, I want to remind you of the key provisions of the ACC2 ZEV regulation. The first is a requirement that a certain percentage of a manufacturer's new vehicle sales be zero emission vehicles, increasing from 35% in the 2026 model year to 100% by the 2035 model year. Second is a suite of assurance measures like minimum range, warranty and durability requirements, and access to repair information that support the use of ZEVs to displace emissions, and access to information, especially in the used vehicle market. These measures are particularly important for helping to ensure lower income consumers who are more likely to purchase used vehicles can access high quality ZEVs and benefit from the program. Sorry, I'm getting used to the mic here. So the ACC2 ZEV regulation provisions take effect beginning in the 2026 model year. The amendments we are considering today are not looking to revise what was adopted in ACC2, but instead are focused on new topics that were not addressed in the ACC2 rulemaking. The first of these is what's called interoperability, which deals with how a vehicle communicates with charging infrastructure and considering what standards may help address interoperability issues. The second is considering new metrics for consumer-facing vehicle labels and what information is most relevant to a consumer considering a ZEV purchase. Lastly, we want to discuss our implementation plans for a provision in the ZEV regulation that incentivizes manufacturers to provide vehicles at a discount to community-based clean mobility projects. So first, let's turn our attention to how vehicles interact with infrastructure. So there have been many headlines lately about public charging being an issue. Studies like the JD Power one referenced on this slide show that dissatisfaction with public EV charging has been concerning and may be getting worse. The public needs reliable and accessible public charging to ensure strong ZEV performance and permanence of those emission reductions. One issue that can prevent drivers from successfully charging their vehicles is communication difficulties between the vehicle and the charger. Those communication difficulties are often addressed on a model-by-model basis. Automakers individually work with charging station manufacturers and operators to diagnose and solve those communication problems with each of their vehicles. With lots of new vehicle models coming to market in the next few years and expanding charging networks, testing vehicle models with charging stations one at a time will become even more burdensome than it already is today. So are there things that can be implemented across all vehicles to prevent some of the interoperability issues from happening in the first place? So we have a fun slide here. So existing vehicles and charging stations talk through communication standards and message sets. However, those communication standards and message sets don't always align. In other words, charging stations and vehicles can run into issues where one device does not work with another, meaning they are not interoperable. Interoperability is really about getting two devices, charging stations and electric vehicles in this case, to agree on communicating in the same language and within the same set of ground rules so they can effectively work together. So here's an example of EV and charging station interaction for our Star Trek and Lord of the Rings fans. So a driver pulls up to a DC fast charger station and plugs in their battery electric vehicle. The charger first asks if the car speaks Klingon. The car can't speak that, but then asks about Elvish, which the charger understands, but there are different dialects. So the car and charger finally settle on a common dialect, Sindarin. So when vehicles and chargers can't speak the same language, or even the same dialect, how can they negotiate when and how to start a charge rate, etc.? So we have several communication standards that are in existence and being implemented in part on vehicles that are available today. ACC2 does not require a vehicle to charger communication standards beyond the requirement to conform with SAE J1772, which requires the most basic level of communication between vehicle and charging equipment. So standards that are being considered include ISO 15118-20, ISO 15118-2, and or DIN 70121. The entire standard may not need to be required like with ISO 15118-20, which has wireless power transfer provisions that may be a nice to have but not a need to have to ensure successful charging events at public charging stations. So we're seeking input on which of the highlighted standards we should adopt, and if the entire standard should be required on the vehicle, or if there are portions that should be specifically included or specifically excluded. And are there any other relevant standards that we should be looking at? However, requiring standards to be used are only part of the story, and they do not ensure successful charging events. So as I mentioned before, manufacturers have been implementing some of those standards on their vehicles for some time now, especially with DIN 7121. But there's no required vehicle side testing that guarantees the standards have been implemented correctly and vehicles conform to those standards. So in May of this year, the California Energy Commission co-sponsored an event with a group called CHARIN, with the event under the name of the Vehicle Interoperability Testing Symposium, or VOLTS. Testing data was gathered during the event, and it shows that there are still interoperability problems with even older standards like DIN 7121, as well as issues with newer ISO 15118 standards. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the report, which maybe highlights some of the problem here, and that the VOLTS test data indicate that interoperability issues are not always on the EVSC side, but can be found on the EV side as well, suggesting that having an appropriate conformance program for both EVs and EVSC could help reduce interoperability issues for both DIN 7121 and ISO 15118 implementations. As we just saw on the previous slide, standards being in place and used do not guarantee successful interoperability between vehicles and charging stations. Those devices must be tested against standards to ensure that they meet the specifications of those standards, also known as conformance testing, where a device is checked to see if it conforms with a standard. CARB has extensive experience doing conformance testing, as it currently does confirmatory testing on manufacturers' test vehicles to make sure that they conform with emissions requirements. We also require that manufacturers conduct conformance testing for OBD systems on vehicles. We are considering developing a conformance test for vehicle side charging systems. which could ensure that all vehicles meet charging standard requirements and give certainty to charging equipment manufacturers and service operators that will work within a certain set of parameters specified by those standards. So we're seeking input on the types of public charging failures that happen on the vehicle side and the relevant portion of the charging standards that would need to be checked for conformance, which could feed into an open source charging conformance test for vehicles. Another topic we are planning to explore as part of this rulemaking is potential updates to what's known as the California Environmental Performance Label. Since 1995, California's smog index label has helped consumers assess the relative smog emissions from new cars. In 2008, CARB introduced the California Environmental Performance Label to provide consumers with both smog and climate information in the form of global warming scores. An example of this label is on the left-hand side of the slide. In 2011, the federal government updated the well-known fuel economy label, which is shown on the right. Since then, CARB has allowed manufacturers to use the federal label to comply with California's environmental performance label requirements, and vehicles have not generally included the California label. As you can see on the federal label here for battery electric vehicles, there's information on emissions, fuel economy measured in miles per gallon, in gasoline equivalent, driving range, and predicted fuel costs and savings, and other information. While the metrics included on the existing fuel economy label are certainly valuable, we're interested in exploring whether there are improvements or additional metrics that California could develop that would be helpful to consumers when they are considering purchasing a ZEV. As we look ahead to increasing ZEV sales in California, we want to ensure that the information provided to consumers considering a ZEV purchase is meaningful to inform their decision-making. CARB is therefore considering opportunities for improved ZEV metrics to include on the CARB environmental performance label, which would accompany the federal fuel economy label. There may be metrics that consumers are interested in that would require CARB to collect new data from automakers at the time they certify their vehicles or process that data we already collect in a new way. So as part of this process, we're looking to hear what kind of information would be valuable. A few of the metrics we've identified from the federal label that could be improved are ranges that are more reflective of highway driving and how hot and cold weather may impact range, charging time information that better reflects typical residential charging and public fast charging, efficiency metrics beyond MPGE or mile per gallon equivalent that more directly connect to how consumers may think of the relationship between charging and distance. An example of this could be miles per kilowatt hour. We seek input on other data or metrics that could be used to generate a better ZEV environmental performance label, as well as key performance indicators and metrics that should be considered for a new ZEV label. Briefly, I want to touch on some of the implementation processes for ACC2. So we wanted to bring up one provision that applies starting in 2024 model year, which creates a pathway for manufacturers to receive ACC2 ZEV values for providing a 25% discount to vehicles and community car share programs. We are currently working with manufacturers, community-based clean mobility project developers, and community-based organizations to increase transparency for this process. This process seeks to make available a list of statewide needs for vehicles for community projects, as well as a list of interested manufacturers. This process is currently occurring through the ZEV Equity Task Force work groups, and I've included the email here if you have any interest in being included in that process, which is zevequity@arb.ca.gov. And with that, I think that wraps up the ZEV assurance measures section, and we'll open it up for questions and comments, and hopefully we get some in the room here finally.
I expect only to be in Klingon.
Yeah, if anybody speaks Klingon, that would be great.
Oh, we have somebody here. Amy, do you want to come down?
Hello, I'm Amy Lilly from Mercedes-Benz. So I wanted to know what timing you're thinking about for the new ZEV assurance measures. I would assume it's past model year 26.
Yeah, I think Anna answered this well, but everything in terms of the timeline will be driven by the scope of the amendments and how quickly this all can come together, and as well as, EPA finishing their rulemaking. We'd like to do fewer rulemakings. That is our goal. I know that you don't believe us, but that is our goal. It wouldn't be starting in 2026. We'd want to talk with you all about lead time, what would be appropriate for these kind of requirements.
Okay, that would be appreciated. And just one add-on as to, will everything be together in one package, or will anything be pulled ahead?
Pulled ahead, I hope not. But one package, we'll do what we can, because we also, we'd like to go forward with whatever is, for ZEV, there will still be things being worked out in the universe of all the different things that are happening in the space. So we're going to do as much as we can in the appropriate time frame. I cannot promise that there will not be future things considered. So I don't want to promise everything, or that we'll be delayed by everything.
Thank you.
Hi, Peter Tridy with the Specialty Equipment Market Association, and I'm just wondering if you can clarify the definition of a ZEV, and specifically whether it includes plug-in hybrids or any other alternative considerations.
For a zero-emission vehicle, there is a definition for a ZEV, and we allow plug-in hybrids to count towards meeting the manufacturer's requirement as long as they meet certain minimum requirements now and into the future. So a plug-in hybrid is not considered a ZEV, but it is used to offset a manufacturer's compliance up to a certain point. When we're talking about ZEV assurance measures, they apply slightly differently between plug-in hybrids and ZEVs, though in some ways they are covered by different regulations. For instance, plug-in hybrids they have to meet a useful life standard under the greenhouse gas and the LEV standards, and they don't have to meet the same one under the ZEV standard that ZEVs have to meet for durability. So there's differences between the two and what is required. And so as we think about this and interoperability, we'll do what we can to align where it makes sense, assuming that there wouldn't need to be special considerations for plug-in hybrids. I don't see any right now, but I'm sure you all will come up with ways that we have to make slight differences. So we will probably be confronted with those as we develop the interoperability standards or conformance tests.
But to be clear, the ZEV, it does have a definition of ZEV, and it's tied to no criteria pollutant emissions, no greenhouse gas emissions, or precursors of either. Thank you.
Hi, Chris Nevers, Rivian. I had a question on the environmental performance label. And if you had been working with EPA on range changes, reason I ask is, first of all, we'd like to be involved if there is a work group. But the last time it took several years when the label was rewritten. And if you did make changes, it would probably become the de facto label. And there's also a broader class. I believe the environmental performance label includes MDVs, not just MDPVs. So you'd be talking about basically additional testing. Thanks.
Yeah, so we've actively been engaged in EPA staff, both the regulatory staff that have the current proposal out, as well as some of the more label-focused staff. And so we understand. I mean, it doesn't make sense to have a California-only thing. If you have last time they were able to eventually incorporate our requirements into the big window sticker on the car, right? So that we don't have to have an add-on sticker if necessary. We have been focused at this point, and we've been trying to talk to the EPA regulatory staff as well on make sure we get the data at the time of cert that would enable such a better label. We know that the actual label process will probably be a lengthier process in terms of, focus groups or something like that to try to get out of the engineer minds and into actually what makes sense and is intelligible to people that are looking and shopping. My label would be an Excel spreadsheet that would help nobody. So we know it's a slow process, but we also know that, you kind of need the data available to CERT to make use of the data label, and if the label tries to come on at the end and then drive the CERT data, it's a kind of a chicken and egg. So we're trying to focus first on hopefully capturing the required data, and then secondarily on how to best present that in a clear, meaningful manner.
Thank you.
And I'll just add that the medium duty label is, I think, slightly different, but we are working with them to try to coordinate on labels.
Thanks.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're all like flooding in now. Okay.
Hello, good afternoon, or good morning still. My name is Sarah Shomrai. I'm manager of Eco Strategy at Hyundai Motor North America. We are requesting that CARB remove the CCS adapter requirements for model year 26 in light of the significant industry shift to NACS SAE standard J3400. So since May of 2023, approximately 95% of the EV market has indicated transition to the North American Charging Standard, NACS. This includes Hyundai and Genesis. Both brands have announced a commitment to switching to NACS starting with model year 2025 vehicles, which go on sale late 24. NACS is also being standardized by the Society of Automotive Engineers, SAE as J3400. This process was launched in July of 23, and a technical information report is expected to be released by December this year, with final standard in June of 2024. So in summary, we request that ACC2 rules are amended to remove the CCS adapter requirement, and we really appreciate your consideration on this issue. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So yes, we are quite aware of the NACS and the J3400. We've been actively talking to the chairman to have CARB representation and involvement on the committee as well. We are certainly encouraged by industry coalescing to a single connector. That is what our desire was last time when we chose CCS, that everybody was headed towards that direction. As Anna and Belinda had said earlier, you know, our planned rulemaking timeframe is still a little ways out there. So I don't know that we'll be able to, we don't at this point have plans to pull something ahead. But, you know, through 2025, you're under the current rules. Through 26 and beyond, even with our regulatory right now, a manufacturer can make their vehicle with NACS, right? They would just be obligated to provide an adapter for free. I am confident that if 3400 continues down the path it does and develops a successful standard, and that we get a little more agreement from the rest of industry, that I think it'd be an easy change for us to accept and achieve the original intent we wanted, which was people to be able to drive into a station and not worry about what kind of connector they have and what kind of connectors on the EVSE. So I do think we're headed in that direction. And I think we'll get there in time for 26 model year production. But we do have to wait and see, let the 3400 play out and make sure there's not any gotchas in there.
Steve, did you change your mind about asking a question?
I think that.
Did she ask your question? Otherwise, okay. Just want to make sure. You got out of your pajamas, I feel like you should. No. Okay, so Joyce, we can switch to the Zoom hand raisers then.
Okay. Lizzie Kutsona, we've unmuted your line. You're free to speak. Please remember to state your name and affiliation.
Hi, this is Lizzie Kutsona here on behalf of Tesla today. Just wanted to echo the remarks made by Hyundai in relation to the NACS standard being included in future rulemaking. Appreciate your consideration, and please keep us as a resource as you move forward in adapting the standards, given the significant shift in the industry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your input.
Joyce, who's our next hand raiser?
Sorry. Rasto Bresny, we have unmuted your line and you're free to speak. Please remember to state your name and affiliation.
Yes, thank you very much. This is Rasto Bresny, the Executive Director for Mika Clean Mobility. For nearly 50 years, Mika has represented the suppliers of technologies to reduce the environmental footprint of vehicles. So you can imagine in 50 years, we've covered everything from traditional combustion vehicles to most recently electric and hydrogen vehicles as well. And this comment is related to the label, which is still up on the screen. And I think this is an excellent opportunity as we see more and more electric vehicles come on the market. We're starting to find some significant differences in their electric efficiency, and I think that's a result of improvements on the various components in the vehicle that MICA members are commercializing, including improvements in battery chemistries, thermal management of batteries and electronics, as well as the power electronics themselves and the motors, the components that go into those motors to improve the overall efficiency of the electric vehicle. So as we think about the label, I think there's the label was originally developed with combustion vehicles in mind, and so then we incorporated some units here from electric vehicles, but perhaps for consumers, kilowatt hours per 100 miles may not kind of ring a bell or sound very familiar. So I think it could be an opportunity to compare different electric vehicles, maybe using the slider scale that's down below, which always gives a 10 to all electric vehicles, but now with the differences that we're seeing, maybe they're not all a 10, and there could be an opportunity to compare the efficiency of different electric vehicles relative to other electric vehicles. So I just want to make that suggestion, and I think there's some opportunity to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment.
Okay. Dean Taylor, we've unmuted your line. You're free to speak. Please remember to state your name and affiliation.
Hi, this is Dean Taylor, Strong Plug-in Hybrid Coalition again. I'm curious regarding the label on batteries. What does either EPA or CARB do regarding anything regarding batteries, emissions, sourcing, chemistry, anything like that?
So we've got two different things we're talking about. So what we talked about today is kind of a consumer-facing window sticker, like the Monroney sticker, right? That gives some basic information about, say, range or charge time or efficiency, kind of a thing, miles per gallon, the stuff that's on there right now, right? That label itself does not have, to my knowledge, of requirements on our side about sourcing and materials or anything like that. Separately, as part of ACC2, we previously adopted a requirement for a battery label, right, to go on vehicle and on each separately replaceable part of the battery pack itself that has some information about the chemistry and some other basic requirements, as well as a QR code that links to more detailed information on that battery. The intent was to help recyclers or potentially rebuilders in being able to have a piece of the battery pack in hand and see a label and get access to what kind of materials are in it. I think that's still different from what you're asking about, which is more about sourcing. We have certainly talked with a couple different groups that have kind of floated a battery passport type of idea. Europe has been looking at something like this that would sort of track materials and track the sourcing of it to try to kind of have a better accounting for it. So Joshua Cunningham at CARB has been tracking some of these efforts internationally as well. So we are looking at that kind of stuff to see if there's a role for that or not. But that's, I think, a little bit more what you're asking about. And so it wasn't part of our proposal today, but it certainly was something we have staff tracking and looking at to see if there's a role for that in California.
I think I'm speculating that if you did focus groups, you'd find a lot of interest among consumers regarding batteries. They're certainly, in the news a lot. Like some have low. Some have lower emissions
Understand.
than others. Some are, from friendlier countries than others. So there's, I think, a lot of interest there. And it's interesting, per my earlier questions about battery mining and manufacturing, there's emissions impacts as well. Another question, though, is on when you talk about interoperability. I mean, charging the vehicle is one thing, but there's huge need in California. You can look at some of the utility general rate cases for helping the grid as well. So whether it's, so it gets into the issue of grid codes for either one-way charging or bidirectional charging. It's a lot more complicated than what you're talking about. So I caution that you don't want to have like unintended consequences in what you're thinking about. It's really cool that you're getting into performance testing, but it's a pretty complicated subject.
I agree, which is why, or at least our first step here, we've been focused on the communication protocol to make sure that CAR and EVSE talk together appropriately, as opposed to minimum requirements or mandating that all vehicles support this ability of vehicle to grid, or that they all support some minimum amount of energy transfer or some energy transfer rate. We think that all that technology is developing quite fast, but there's at least some standardized messages on how to do some of that we probably think it would be nice if sooner than later the cars responded gracefully to such messages, so that manufacturers that choose to implement such features, there'll be kind of a predictable way for EVSE and the other side of the house to design to it, and for less chance of unintended consequences of sending such messages to a vehicle that was not designed to accept it and didn't even respond to the message properly, right? So if we at least start with the message set, and at this point, it's still up to the manufacturer how much they want to support or not support those kind of actual capability, but they still should respond nicely to questions or requests from equipment to do it.
Thank you.
Okay, Joyce, next hand raiser, please.
Yes. Neil Kohler, we have unmuted your line and you're free to speak. Please remember to state your name and affiliation.
Thank you. Neil Kohler, representing the Renewable Fuels Association, the leading trade association for ethanol producers in the United States. And I thank staff for the comprehensive presentation, and specifically want to support the notion of higher ethanol blends as an important component of improving the ACC2. I can think of actually no other singular measure than higher ethanol blends that simultaneously significantly reduces criteria pollutants, GHG emissions, and at a lower cost, significantly lower cost to consumers. Graham mentioned that in his earlier comments, but that we see E85 consistently selling for anywhere between $1.50 and $2, and in some cases in excess of a $2 discount to regular gasoline. So from an equity consideration, very positive in that regard. From a GHG emission benefit, it's 50% cleaner ethanol than gasoline today, with a commitment to achieve net zero emissions. So it's just getting better while gasoline incrementally gets worse. So our specific comment is that, and we made it in the prior amendments, is that by model year certain, in this case 2026 would be appropriate, that all IC engines sold be flex fuel capable. It is a negligible cost to automakers. They know how to do it. They've done it. It's just the CAFE credits are no longer available to the extent they were, nor do we think that's necessarily the best approach. Just a simple requirement is an incredible insurance policy for achieving additional GHG benefits, and also addresses the performance of the plug-in hybrid vehicles that was mentioned earlier in the presentation. Flex fuel vehicles can run on 100% renewable. There are providers in California that are currently using a renewable naphtha for the hydrocarbons. So it is possible in these flex fuel vehicles to actually run on 100% very low or zero carbon fuels. So very supportive of ACC, very supportive of the electrification efforts, and also very supportive of the recognition by staff that we're going to have internal combustion engines and liquid fuels for a long time, and we need to decarbonize as quickly as possible. Lastly, Mike, I really appreciate your talking to the other side of the house, because right now the E15 was mentioned. It would be great if this could be integrated, because it's really incomprehensible that E15 certification has not yet happened in California. California and Montana being the only two states that don't recognize it as a fuel. And today, E15 would be delivering 2 million metric tons annually of additional GHG emissions. So that's something we can do today as we build toward a future where more and more of the vehicles are running on higher blends. So, you know, in any good words you could put in, and as we integrate these policies, because you know, the LCFS, you know, ethanol even trapped at 10% and with some increase in the 85 has generated, you know, 3 of 10 credits under LCFS program to date, and can do a lot more with higher blends. So appreciate your time and attention to this very important opportunity.
Okay, great. Thank you for the input. I mean, you know, that's what we're seeking, right? Is input on potential ideas here. So that's certainly a plausible, you know, that's certainly an idea on the table about requiring some point future ICE to be FFE capable, or some portion or some fraction or all of them, or some subset of them or something like that. That's some of the things that the ideas that we want to hear about. So we appreciate that input.
Okay, Joyce, next hand raiser.
Laura Moorhead, we have unmuted your line. You're free to speak. Please remember to state your name and affiliation.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you, CARB staff, for your hard work. My name is Laurel Moorhead, and I'm here on behalf of TransferFlow. TransferFlow has been in business for 40 years in California, manufacturing high-quality liquid fuel systems and providing high-paying local jobs, boosting our economy. I would like to ask CARB staff about what allowances are going to be made in this measure for alternative fuels in the future. For example, my friend Mike Copeland, that you can Google, he drives around a hydrogen-powered vehicle that he built himself. And of course, there's no carbon because it's hydrogen, and he did have a shed test, and it blew very low NOx, lower than the upcoming standards for plug-in hybrid passenger vehicles. So I think that any way that industry chooses to meet emissions levels should be allowed. Tesla's only been in business for 20 years. So if somebody wants to start a new car company selling hydrogen powered vehicles that are hydrogen internal combustion engine, not hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, then they should be allowed to make a hydrogen internal combustion engine if it's very low NOx. And the same with like PG&E has said, we are not going to electrify our utility trucks. That's PG&E, they get free electricity, and they're converting their utility trucks to renewable natural gas. They've been running on natural gas for a long time, but they're opening a renewable natural gas facility in California where they plan to run their vehicles on it, and they plan to provide households that use natural gas in the houses with the renewable natural gas. And looking at the California's electric grid, the carbon intensity of the California electric grid is currently 79.43 to 81.49 grams of CO2 emissions per megajoule of energy, where if we look at renewable natural gas made from dairy manure, it's down to negative 420 grams of carbon intensity, which means that it took 420 less grams of carbon to clean up that dairy manure than traditional methods that farms use. And so if, you know, like Honda used to have a renewable natural gas powered Honda Civic that you could go buy. There is a renewable natural gas fueling station right by my house. And so I think that the standard should be, the rules should be technology neutral, and it should regulate emissions levels, and however industry chooses to meet those emissions levels should be allowed, because we don't want to stymie future inventions. We don't want to keep the next Tesla company from opening because you said nothing but electric vehicles are allowed and someone wants to make a car company selling hydrogen powered vehicles. And so I'd like to ask, is there an allowance for future technologies that run on alternative and biofuels? Thank you for your time.
All right, thank you for your comment. So a couple things. So you know, we have our low carbon fuel standard, which obviously addresses all fuels and rewards those with low carbon intensity. And so a lot of the renewable natural gas and stuff that you're talking about and hydrogen all factor in there. We have state laws even about hydrogen stations have to have at least 30%, and it ramps up over time. In the vehicle side, in our criteria pollutant standards, they are fuel neutral. We have different certification bins available and a fleet average. And to the extent that some fuels allow you to emit it lower, there's incentive for the manufacturer to make them because it makes their job easier for the remaining part of their vehicles. It makes it easier to meet the fleet average. So to the extent that hydrogen internal combustion or any other alternative fuel allows them to meet lower hydrocarbon plus NOx standards, that'll allow them to offset other vehicles at lower cost. So I think we already have a structure in place that allows and incentivizes the manufacturers to find the cheapest solutions to get there. The exception that we have that we mentioned is in our zero emission vehicle regulation. We define the zero emission vehicles as those that have no emissions at all of criteria pollutant or precursor to a criteria pollutant or a greenhouse gas. In those cases, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles qualify as ZEVs, battery electrics qualify as ZEVs, but hydrogen internal combustion still has some criteria pollutant emissions and still has emission controls that deteriorate over time and doesn't meet the ZEV definition. So just like any other fuel, it can be certified even as low as, I think, the SULEV 15 is our lowest bin. On a fleet average, it's SULEV 30. So anything certified that low would help manufacturers tremendously, but it just doesn't allow it to be counted as a true zero.
Okay, so I have a follow-up question with that. So the definition of zero emission vehicle is zero tailpipe emissions, but that does not account for the emissions from generating the electricity. And so that's where the definition of zero emission vehicle falls short, because like I just gave an example of how the electricity was creating far more emissions than the utility truck running off RNG. I just gave you an example of how the electricity was higher emissions. So that's a faulty definition of zero emissions when it's only limited to the tailpipe emissions and you're not looking at the whole picture of all the emissions from creating the electricity also.
So in California, at least in the criteria pollutant space, we have separate rules that apply and limit the emissions of electricity generation and apply to that kind of that side of the house. So you're right, our vehicle criteria pollutant regs don't take that into account, but the other stationary source criteria pollutant regs do account for that.
So you're not comparing apples to apples. You have to compare the emissions from the electricity generation.
And in the greenhouse gas regulation, we do in the vehicle regulation assess an additional incremental emissions on those that use electricity to operate on the road to account for that electricity generation. But we assess what's incremental in generating the electricity over what's incremental to what's generating gasoline. Gasoline was the baseline because that was the majority of our fleet. So we look at incremental to that. So there's emissions with upstream fuel production. And I said, because our fleet was gasoline based, that was our baseline. And we look at assessing incremental emissions to that. So it is accounted for in the light duty GHG space. And in the criteria pollutant space, I said we have separate regulations that apply to different stationary sources, including electricity generation and some pretty aggressive renewable electricity generation requirements on the books already.
Okay, I just don't think you should require citizens to only buy electric vehicles. They should be able to sell any vehicle that meets emissions levels.
Understood.
Thank you.
Okay, Joyce, is there one more hand raiser?
Yes, there is one more. Laura Ranker, we've unmuted your line and you're free to speak. Please remember to state your name and affiliation.
Hi, this is Laura Ranker from the California Electric Transportation Coalition. And I was just curious with regard to the interoperability that you're looking at, how are you incorporating the work that the CEC is doing, including the upcoming workshop? And what can we expect in terms of coordination between your two agencies as you move forward with this rulemaking?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I do know CEC is online with us today if they have anything else to share. We have been working with them and will continue to work with them. As you all may know, CEC has more jurisdiction over the chargers themselves, and we are dealing with the vehicle side of the standards. But we have been in communication, and we have kind of a plan moving forward to be even in more constant communication about that. So if there's a desire to kind of meet with us both at the same time, I'm sure that would be even more efficient. So you can let us know, and we can continue to meet about what comes next on the interoperability standards.
That sounds great. Thanks.
Okay, we have a couple more questions online because I think that we're through the hand raisers, but Joyce, you can let me know. I'm going to go with first. Is CARB staff planning on introducing changes to the OBD regulation, which is 1968.2 for the gasoline vehicles with this rulemaking?
And then the next question too about is CARB planning to request more standardized data for ZEVs? So I'll point out two things that we talked about today that could impact OBD. As Belinda talked about in the criteria pollutant world, we have proposed several bins. We adopted several bins in ACC2. EPA has proposed some slightly different ones. OBD has thresholds that are tied to that certification bin. So one way or the other, wherever both agencies end up, because we have such a dominant role in OBD certification, we will probably need to make adjustments to the OBD reg to make sure it comprehends all the existing certification bins between our program and the federal program. That's a reality. It's what's happened in LEV 2 and LEV 3 in prior ones, because we do pretty much the OBD certification for the nation. So there'll I think for sure have to be some change in OBD relative to that. Secondly, we talked about the fleet utility factor and plug-in hybrids and assessing how much of their mileage is done electrically versus gasoline. And we're looking for input there. That is the one that's the quickest to mind to me that might entail more standardized data to help understand, quantify, or measure some way, shape, or form of how PHEVs are being used so that we can accurately measure and quantify their emission benefit for manufacturers. That said, there may be other things, but on my short list, that would be it. We already have some data in there tracking since it rolled out, started in the 2019 model year on PHEV usage, but it may be that we're missing a couple of key things that would be helpful in better informing how they're being used. So those are the two that I would mention there for potential OBD implications.
Okay, the next question comes from John Shears. What considerations are light duty staff making regarding inductive charging standards, which is being considered through the SAE J2954 standard, which might become even more prevalent in the coming years? Might be early days, but I imagine that we're tracking, and we are tracking. But in terms of requiring standardization for every vehicle, that's just a different type of requirement than what we're requiring right now. We're going to stick with the hard wired standard, but I don't think that anything that we have in the books prohibits manufacturers from following an additional standard to allow for inductive charging. But we are always happy to take comment on that, or any suggestions on where you'd like to see CARB go with that. Okay. So there's another comment in here from Martin Johansson on the subject of charging communication conformance testing. Testing only on one side of the problem might not solve the whole problem. So, we're obviously been very clear that we're considering a vehicle conformance test. Any thoughts on also doing the same testing for the charger equipment side using the same test method? And again, this would be more under that CEC side of the shop and what they will be considering doing. And I encourage you they will have a full public comment process and workshop process that I think even starts this very soon, like December 1st, I just got a notice for. So I would encourage you to participate in that. And again, we are happy to continue to meet alongside CEC on some of these issues.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, sort of reiterating what we showed earlier on the slides about really focusing on the vehicle side to try to get that sort of nailed down to make sure that the vehicles conform with the standards. We see that as pretty important as sort of making the process work a little bit better, but we're also open to input on where we might be missing things if we focus solely on the vehicle and not the total interaction. So if you have suggestions or ideas or have insights into how that works, we'd be more than happy to talk to you and get your input on that process.
So we are at 11:30, so I just want to make sure that Anna gets to finish up some of the last slides that we have, and then we're happy to stay here for further questions and answers afterwards.
Okay, so again, just very quickly, we'll go over the timeline and next steps. Folks are free to, well, you're free to leave whenever, I guess, but we will sort of, that'll be the end of our piece once we get through that. But as Belinda said, we can kind of stick around for more Q&A. As to the extent that there are some. So going over the timeline, today was a kickoff process. We're launching this process today. We're going to have an open public comment period that should be available now on our website. That'll be open through January 15th to submit written public comment. So we really look forward to hearing from you with your feedback on the concepts we presented today and your priorities for this rulemaking. Of course, we'll be looking for EPA to finalize their rule sometime this spring, and then we'll really launch into more of our policy development and workshop process. We're planning to hold at least 3 workshops and community meetings through the summer of 2024 and the spring of 25. And then our hope is to release a staff report for these amendments in the spring or summer of 2025 and go to the board that summer or early fall. So that's sort of what to expect. A little bit on how we're thinking about community outreach in the context of this rulemaking. As with the original ACC2 rulemaking process, we really prioritize having a transparent and open process as we coordinate with our stakeholders, and we think that's especially important for communities that are disproportionately impacted by vehicle pollution. So using some of the lessons from the ACC2 process and other public outreach through CARB, as we've been thinking about our community outreach plans, we know we want to leverage existing meetings and processes wherever feasible. We know there's a lot of meeting fatigue, and we want to do what we can to just plug into things that already exist. It's already coming up that we know we need to coordinate both with other CARB programs that work in this space and with our sister agencies like the Energy Commission. So that's a piece we're thinking about as well. We want to try to use different engagement approaches with our interested and affected communities. So not just workshops like this, but community meetings and social media and different kinds of outreach strategies. And then lastly, as we're thinking about this, we want to support access to data on emissions and information on control technologies. So that's a little bit more about how our outreach is going to be shaped going forward. And lastly, to just distill some of the next steps, we're going to be continuing to develop these proposals. We're going to be considering the feedback we heard today and, of course, in our written public comment period. So we really encourage you to submit that public comment through the comment docket. There's a link in the workshop slides. And of course, reach out to us if you need access to that. We encourage you to subscribe to our listserv if you aren't already. That's the best way to get information about upcoming workshops or other public process elements. And then please reach out to us. Our email is cleancars@arb.ca.gov. And so we look forward to hearing from many of you. So that's the end of what we wanted to share. I think we can, again, folks are always free to leave now if they would like. But we'll keep the Zoom open and the comment period open now as well if there's still lingering questions. But officially, thank you all for participating and for coming. We can maybe give a minute for people to filter out, but that's what we have. Thank you.
Joyce, does anyone have their hand raised online?
No.
It looks like we do have a comment in the room. Another person standing again. Excellent.
Chris Nevers again. First, I wanted to say Rivian agrees with what Hyundai had said and Tesla and what Steve was going to say about NACS. So we 100% agree with that. But the question I had was, there's been a lot of talk about upstream, and I was wondering if you could comment on the process or what the plans were for looking at the carbon intensive electricity going forward. I think the number being used now is about 11 years old. So I was curious if that's going to be re-examined.
So we're all trying to find somebody who knows this. As we teed up, yes, we're considering what to do about upstream emissions for ZEVs. Right in our current GHG rule, we do try to assess the incremental above and beyond gasoline. If we were to continue a process an approach like that, I think we would need to update our gasoline assumptions as well as our electricity or hydrogen assumptions, right? Because the scope of the land has changed quite a bit. So yes, that would be a process we would have to get input on, because as you know, with electricity, the grid has been getting cleaner every year, so you have to decide what number makes sense for a vehicle that's starting its life now, and the grid will be cleaner 5 years from now when it's and stuff like that. So luckily, our electricity grid has been cleaning up even faster than our regulations require. So that's a good news story. I think hydrogen is coming along, albeit at a slower pace, but we've got some statutory requirements that force it to be percentage of renewable. But I think even the gasoline upstream assumptions would need to be updated as well. I think things have changed there, and so that's part of the difficulty, is assessing those big numbers and subtracting two big numbers to come up with a really small number or something like that. But in California, we do have all those other sectors of emitters covered. So this is not the primary way we get at encouraging lower emissions from electricity generation or gasoline production. But it's certainly a consideration we want to make sure to have in there, and see if it makes if it's a useful distinction to better account for differences in all fuels. Thank you.
We do have a raised hand. Are you all good with going ahead with it?
Yes, please.
Laurel Moorhead, I have unmuted and you're free to speak. Please state your name and affiliation again.
Laurel Moorhead again with TransferFlow again. And I just, I wanted to comment on that last thing you said, that an electric vehicle starting now, the electricity will be cleaner in 5 years. But at the same time, the renewable fuels will also be cleaner in 5 years, and vehicle technologies are constantly improving. We've seen huge advancements in clean vehicle technologies, hugely part to CARB's work, like historic work since the 60s. But so when you talk about future technologies, you have to compare future technologies to future technologies. You can't compare current technologies to future technologies. Because I always hear, well, electricity vehicles will be so much cleaner someday. Well, all vehicles will be cleaner.
Understood. All right. The distinction, because CARB's been doing this for so long, right? The distinction we usually make is that when you put an internal combustion engine vehicle on the road, it's got emission controls, and to date, the emission controls deteriorate over time. We have taken many actions to slow that deterioration down, and we have far improved the situation with much longer useful life, longer warranty, and the suppliers and manufacturers have done an outstanding job of making things durable. But generally, as our INM and smog check program shows, right, things do deteriorate over time. They do malfunction. People tend to point that out as a stark difference to EVs, which are mostly a function of the electricity generation. And our rules for stationary source and electricity generation have been forcing that electricity generation to get cleaner each year at a pretty remarkable pace compared to anything that gasoline refinery or production or delivery has been doing, or that vehicles themselves have been able to do. So it is still an appreciable difference, but yes, and any assumptions about incremental upstream emissions or upstream emissions, you have to take into account what time period you're talking about, which includes some prediction of what's going to happen in the future or what's happening in the future, or anchoring to the same thing. I agree, it does not make sense to try to compare one's future performance versus something's past performance and hold them accountable that way, and that's not how our regulations are set up. But
right, and like Conoco says they want to start producing renewable gasoline, you know, non-petroleum based gasoline. Like those are great strides. So a vehicle sold 5 years ago using renewable gasoline is creating less emissions than it would on petroleum based gasoline.
On the greenhouse gas side, absolutely, right? On the criteria pollutant side, probably not, but on the greenhouse gas side, yes. And our low carbon fuel standard is to some extent forcing that to happen and getting us significant greenhouse gas reductions every year.
Okay, thank you for your time.
Do we have one more?
Hello, this is Jun from Hyundai America Technical Center. My question is very simple. Since ARB is considering the anti-backsliding mechanism, so it seems like that ARB is not considering to bring the deemed to comply option back to its GHG regulation. Is my understanding correct?
So we have said all along, at least in the GHG space, we think it makes sense to have California requirements, standalone California requirements to ensure us protections here. But it does not make sense for us to expect gasoline vehicles to deploy significantly different technologies in a significantly different time frame than what the federal regulations require. We have done that in the past in the criteria pollutant space, but it was, you know, let's face it, for the many years, it was a difference in a catalytic converter, a catalyst, right? It doesn't make sense in the GHG world to think that that makes sense for hybridization or advanced transmissions or engine technology. So our goal here is to participate in the EPA process. We're looking at where they end up. We want to end up with a California regulation that requires a similar level of greenhouse gas technology deployment in the same type of time frame on gasoline vehicles. We definitely focused on a ZEV rollout. We'll continue to do that. But as Anna noted, we can't really afford any going backwards at all on GHG. So we're trying not to continue at breakneck speed on gasoline, so you can focus resources on EV development, but we're trying to not slide backwards a little bit there too. So that's why it's a delicate balance to try to get that right mixture. I do not think a deemed to comply is a likely scenario because we're going to have our ZEV regulation sets us to be on a more aggressive ZEV technology trajectory. So numerically, it's going to look different than a federal provision no matter what, because we're going to have a higher amount of ZEVs. But the idea is to try to match the types of technology deployment on gasoline vehicles so that one car, one system can get certified in both places and meet their requirement. But I don't think it'll be able to be in the form of a deemed to comply type environment.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, and I have a question here, more about the mobility projects that we showed on slide 48. Let me just describe that. In Advanced Clean Cars 2, we adopted provisions that allow manufacturers to enter into already a whole system of mobility projects that are funded for individual communities throughout California. These deploy light-duty vehicles in different ways, but the most common way that they deploy light-duty vehicles is through community car share programs, and this is really smaller than something like Lyft or Uber operating in a city. This is more intentional, servicing a set group of people and a set amount of cars, usually owned and operated by a community-based organization or by a city. And so when manufacturers provide a discount of 25% to a new ZEV, then they get some value for that. So I hope that answers your your question. We're not making any changes to that. We're just trying to figure out ways, more transparent ways, to connect manufacturers with ongoing or future CARB projects, because it's hard on a very granular level to make those connections without having a really high amount of resources spent to make that happen. So we want to improve the efficiency and the transparency around that process. So that was from Tom Green. If you have more questions, Tom, you feel free to connect to us through the ZEV Equity email, and we'd be happy to meet with you further.
Joyce, any more hand raisers?
Nope.
Okay. No one? Anyone? Last person? Okay, well,
we just got a hand raised.
Go for it.
James Frey, we've unmuted you and you're free to speak. Please state your name and affiliation.
Hello, Jim Fry from 2050 Partners. We help the California IOU Codes and Standards Group make building codes better each cycle. We work very closely with the BSC on building codes, and we're now working with them on the connectors at the charging locations. And we are very interested in cost optimizing what the site hosts have to work with related to their maintenance of cords and such. And the BSC and HCD have organized code language about NEMA receptacles for customer provided EVSEs, portable EVSEs out of their trunk. And that's cool. Linked to this is the opportunity for a new type of cord that connects to a cordless EVSE. So the EVSE at the post has no cord to maintain, but it does have the full power of flexible demand, variable power, and some of the better features that an EVSE-based experience could provide. I understand the ACC2 has a portable charger expectation for the vehicles. There may be a different cord coming in the future, and I'd like to know whom on the team I could interact with to make sure that what we're learning from the SAE efforts could be brought to your attention as soon as possible. So,
yeah, we're a little aware of the efforts ongoing in that area. Yeah, you can come talk to us. Yeah, me specifically, Ryan Hart. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say and what's going on in that space.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, I think it's lunchtime then, huh? Thank you all for coming in person and online. I hope to see you again in the spring for our next workshop. Thank you. Bye.